Thank you, and good afternoon, everyone. And thank you to RCMI and to WIIS Canada for hosting this event today. I think we're in a pretty special location for today's activities. I'm very pleased to be moderating the opening panel for today's events on new technologies and national security. It would be an understatement to say that technology is changing our lives in ways that we may not even appreciate. Rapid developments in artificial intelligence, autonomy, cyber-physical systems, networking and social media, and disinformation are changing the national security landscape in fairly significant ways. Nation-states have new tools at their disposal for political influence. Non-state actors and individuals are harnessing the power of social media, and artificial intelligence and automation are giving rise to profound questions about the role of humans in conflict and war. And indeed, all of these questions are top of mind for senior policymakers, defense and security practitioners alike. I'm very pleased that we've got Najma Sultana and Dr. Alex Wilner with us today to set the scene for the day's activities and provide their insights into emerging technologies and their impact on national security. I'm also pleased that we'll have an opportunity to hear from both a practitioner and an academic on this particular panel. So each panelist will have about 20 minutes, 25 minutes for their presentations, after which we'll open the floor up to all of you for a Q&A period. It's my job to keep the trains running on time, and I'm rarely early to anything, so we'll see how this goes. This will be a learning moment for me, indeed. So Najma is going to lead the charge today and speak to us about cybersecurity in the context of critical infrastructure. She is a communications and electronics engineer and is currently the director of planning and programs at Hydro Ottawa. In addition, she's been a leader and change driver, and I noticed in your bio, Najma, that you use the word driver a lot. I expect that's probably deliberate. She certainly is a trailblazer in her field. So she's held a number of related information technology posts in the last 20 years or so. So with that, I'll hand the floor over to Najma Sultana.
Thank you, Melinda. First, I would like to thank the RCMI and WIIS for inviting me, and thank you, Dan, for graciously hosting me. And it's a pleasure to share the panel with you, Melinda and Alex. So this morning when we were coming, we probably woke up this morning, took a shower, got ready, got into the transportation of our choice. Some of you took the car, or like me, I took the train. Some of us flew. And, you know, we might have stopped by for a coffee, paid with our credit card, possibly drove by the hospital here. In any case, we're here now. What have I talked about? This lifestyle that we take for granted, this is our way of life, and this represents societal order. And this is the way of life that we want to preserve. Throughout this routine that I talked about, we have touched multiple sectors of what we call critical infrastructure, and Public Safety Canada has defined 10 critical infrastructure sectors. So this is what I'm going to be talking about. The center of the donut for critical infrastructure is the electricity sector. And Sergio Marchi of the Canadian Electricity Association has said that the electricity sector is the most important of all the critical infrastructure sectors because all the sectors need power to operate. I would submit that there are really no silos anymore, and we are all interdependent on each other. And it is the stability and the reliability of the grid that I am charged to do. I'm going to talk today about my practical experience in the field as to what is happening and why we need to be concerned today about the reliability and stability of the grid against cyber attacks. Did you know that every day our grid is under attack from various adversaries? So who are these adversaries? Canada has adversaries targeting us of three types, I would say. One are those who are interested in intellectual property, in trade secrets, arms secrets, in causing physical damage, spreading misinformation, influencing people, causing mischief. So these are generally nation-state actors whose motivation is geopolitical, power, ambition, territorial expansion, trade expansion. We also have another kind of adversary, which is in it for financial profit, and these are the cyber criminals. At the same time, bear in mind that heavily sanctioned states like North Korea are reverting to cybercrime as an easy way to raise funds to basically finance their missions. And then lastly, we have the ideological actors who are there to promote their ideology through different means. So in the utility sector where I work, what are the threat vectors that we see? In past years, we did not see geopolitical state-sponsored actors as much, but in the last 5 to 8 years, we have really seen that nation states have come to the forefront of the threat vectors that utility sector faces. We also face a different and growing business model. Our business model used to be a risk-averse business model, very regulated and slow-moving, very predictable, but that's not the case anymore. We are required in our disrupting environment to look for new sources of revenue. And as part of this, we are EBITDA-driven, profit-driven, quick time to market, and in the speed of trying to do things faster and faster, there is the danger that we take more risks and overlook certain security requirements. We also have a changing technological landscape that is redefining critical infrastructure, it's redefining security, and it's redefining the way we interact with one another. For example, just Hydro Ottawa alone, we have over 300,000 smart IP meters, and there is data flowing across the city through these smart meters. We have over 58,000 street lights that are all IP connected, and we have LED lights that we dim through this remote control mechanism with sensors. And we also have got to prepare for over 100,000 autonomous vehicles. We've just announced that we are going to test out 100 autonomous vehicles. So all of this means that we have really got to look at the threat vectors and the threat surface that's an expanding threat surface. We have third-party suppliers in our supply chain that could form soft targets no matter how much we harden the grid. We have a lack of awareness within our internal staff that we need to ensure are educated to the risks that face us and how they should be navigating this landscape. And lastly, we have a regulator who is only now beginning to take cyber threats seriously and put in a framework. My team, in fact, participated with the Ontario Energy Board to come up with a cybersecurity framework, and from June of 2018, we are requiring that every utility in Ontario will be required to run penetration testing for vulnerabilities in our edge, and we are also going to ask the presidents of each of these utilities to testify that they have a program in place. Why are we taking this so seriously? The Canadian underwriter has released a report which says that following the financial sector, it is energy and utilities which is going to be facing continuous systemic attacks from malevolent actors. So I talked to you about the threat surface, and this is just pictorially representing the surface. And what you see, with that little picture of the grid, that is what we call the industrial control systems. And in the past, our systems were air-gapped, which means they were isolated from the corporate network, and that form a natural protection. But now with the sharing of data and the requirement to move information to cloud and share information, they're also getting more interconnected, and it increases risk. So I'm going to talk about a watershed year for the energy and the critical infrastructure sector, which is 2010. 2010 marked the weaponization of cyberspace to cause physical damage in the kinetic world using cyber means. Well, I don't know, how many of you have heard of Stuxnet here? Okay, fantastic. So if I'm repeating information you already know, just, feel free to interrupt. What the Stuxnet virus did was that it targeted Iran's nuclear program. And although there is no attribution and no official admission, we all know that it was the United States and Israel together jointly who came up with this very sophisticated program to attack the Iranian centrifuges. And what was remarkable is that 4 zero-day vulnerabilities were exploited in the Microsoft operating system. Zero-day vulnerability means that there's no patch available, and that just means that the attack was very, very well funded, very well organized, and the payload was that through a particular model of a Siemens PLC, the centrifuges were targeted to do 3 things. Number 1, the rotor speed of these centrifuges were periodically changed to either spin too fast or too slow, and the pressure in the centrifuges was again changed to either be too high or too low. But like I said, it worked slowly and periodically. And what was brilliant is when the change was done, at the time the centrifuges were malfunctioning, recorded reports were run so that the operators saw a very normal operation, and it took Iran several months before they figured out that there's something wrong. Why were the centrifuges blowing up? And it decimated Iran's nuclear program, and essentially they lost millions of dollars worth of enriched uranium. Now, I've talked about the payload, but how did the virus get in? Does anyone know? Okay, go ahead, Eric.
I believe it was a contaminated flash drive.
Correct, yes. And how did it get in there? We don't know whether it was through a innocent Iranian engineer or double agent, but that's speculation. But basically, what could have been done to have prevented it? What kind of cyber program could have helped us? Does anyone know? Yeah, go ahead.
Basically, an awareness program would have helped so the individual person does not pick up a flash drive and go, what's on this?
Correct, that's one aspect. Anyone else? I brought a USB stick and I had something on it. Do you want to try? So my USB stick that I brought, it does not allow code to be executed from the USB stick onto any computer I connect it to. So what I'm trying to get at is the entry point showed a weakness in the cyber program, and so it means that it could have been a preventable attack. And then for a few years, we didn't hear anything about physical attack through cyber means in the critical infrastructure sector until December of 2015. So I see we have some people from Ukraine here. You're probably very familiar with what happened. My video is not going to play, so you're going to have to deal with my melodious voice talking about what actually happened. So in Ukraine, what happened was that essentially about 200,000 people were out of power when, through cyber means, their grid north of Kiev was attacked, and it was attacked in this way. The cyber kill chain, as we call it, it was following a phishing attack, which really means, for those of you who don't know, and I think most of you are very well aware, through an email campaign where somebody must have clicked onto this email link, and that's how the virus got inside their network, their corporate network. And following this, what happens is there is a long period of reconnaissance and credential harvesting until there is credential theft and elevating of privileges through lateral movement. Then, you masquerading with essentially very legitimate credentials, the attackers were able to get VPN access into the SCADA network from the corporate network, and then be able to take over remote control of a workstation, and then the payload was dropped to control and operate the breakers. So the video, which I could not play, shows that the operator saw the mouse moving and without them even touching it, and their cursor was going to the breakers and opening the breakers. This was at the same time accompanied by a denial of service to the call center, which means that users could not call in and report that they were having outages. So this was really a very well-planned, sophisticated attack. But again, I want you to bear in mind that I mentioned the entry point was through a phishing campaign. What added insult to injury was that the whole attack was repeated exactly a year later. And in the second attack, does anyone know the difference between the first and the second attack? Yeah, go ahead, Caroline.
I can't remember. The one is, it was just one grid, and no, just one thing, and then the other one was the distribution.
The second one, what was really, really fantastic from the attacker side is they automated this entire operation. They had learned from the first attack, so they built upon it, which means that in that first year, something happened. The Ukrainian team had not learned and had not applied the controls that could have prevented the second attack. And again, the second attack had yet a third, fourth dimension to it, which is that it's called crash override malware. That's the name given to it. It basically deployed what we call the kill disk. So the operator could no longer take remote control to close the breakers again so that they could resume operations. Ukraine had to send manual, basically send trucks and take manual control of these substations to restore power back, and so that led to confusion, and that led to time lost. So my point is that if someone else could do it to someone, we could do it to others, or other adversaries could do it, it could happen to us, and it just means we need to be aware what happened, how it happened, and where the weak links are. I would submit that what we need is military-grade defenses for our critical infrastructure. There are many other targets that I'm not going to dwell about, but these were two very sensational ones. But essentially, there are more and more attacks taking place. The North American grid is interconnected, so even if our adversaries are targeting our neighbor, we are still going to be impacted. There are over 5.5 million lines of power cable, and there are over 3,300 utilities, the coast to coast. Not only that, many of these are small utilities who do not have the resources to have a strong cyber program. So, the very fact that the grid is interconnected means that these soft targets have to be brought into the cyber programs. Whatever I showed until now did not talk about attribution or admission, because that has not happened till date. This year, in 2018, in March, we have a report in CNN, and we see a marked shift. The past years where we did not want to escalate tensions and no names were taken, that's a thing of the past. The US Senate has named Russia publicly and accused them of cyber attacks on the power grid. And there's a clip I wanted to play, but basically the question is, why is this so? Is this a first step towards deterrence by naming and shaming? Is this a different strategy? I mean, Alex will talk more about it, I'm sure, in his presentation, but we need to be aware that there is now a shift in government policy and tactics. As I told you, the North American grid is interconnected, and has everything I've said so far been off the media and, it happens to someone else out there? No, it doesn't. We've seen it. My own team has seen it, and we've been working with the team of Caroline, so she knows what I'm talking about. How do we operate? Well, we get the threat intelligence feeds from organizations like CSIRC, the U.S. Department of Homeland Security, CSC. We subscribe to these. And this is really a very important detective capability that we depend on, because if you didn't have these organizations, it would be very difficult for a private organization like ours to have these detective capabilities in place. Our budget is around 5%. Cybersecurity budgets at max tend to be about 5% of IT spending. That's not a lot, and we could not possibly build these sophisticated capabilities if it wasn't for these agencies, so that's something to bear in mind. Then when we get the threat intelligence feed, what we do is that we extract valuable information. They are called indicators of compromise, and we populate our controls. The way that we have our cyber program is that we follow a defense in-depth strategy. Those of you from the military can completely understand what I'm talking about, because that's a layered defense. Layer 1 gets breached, layer 2 will protect you, and so on, from the edge to the end user. So then, many of the tools we use, they use AI, because there's millions of lines of logs, impossible for a human to read through. So then our tools alert us against any activities that they detect that may be similar to these behaviors that we've been alerted about. And we triage and contain and eradicate the hits, and we also get alerted on future behaviors. So in this way, should we find some anomaly, then we inform and report back to the organizations that we receive feeds from, and the cycle goes on. So what happened last year? So last summer we got such a feed from CSIRT advising us that there is a target attack on the energy sector. So we took those feeds, and we knew we got a few valuable indicators and a behavior of a pattern of exploitation. So then what we did is we populated our controls, and what do you think we found? So we found what is called a watering hole. So this confirmed that indeed there is activity, and just from the behaviors and the information that we got, the IP addresses and so on, we understand that it's Russia. Again, no admissions. So what's a watering hole? What a watering hole is that you target a victim organization's website, which then interacts with an entire sector. So this particular organization interacts and sells goods and services to multiple energy sector organizations across, well, actually it's worldwide, but mostly in the United States and Canada. So there was malware on this website, which was then making what we call SMB calls out to the energy sector websites that were visiting this website. Had we not had proper controls, we could have been compromised. Was there anyone else on our grid that was compromised? We don't know. So what I've talked about so far are attacks to the grid that would directly, or attacks to the sector that would directly affect delivery of electricity. Now, there are other ways in which we also get attacked, which is through what I call the cyber criminals, monetization of attacks through either ransomware, very widely known, or we've heard of WannaCry and we've heard of NotPetya in the last couple of years. And the problem is, because of our interconnectedness, the movement and the rapid, what we call a pandemic, could take place within 4 days. WannaCry spread to over 150 countries globally in less than 4 days, and really caused havoc across an entire spectrum of industry. The latest that you will see in this creative world of monetization via cyber means is cryptojacking. How many of you know what cryptojacking is? So you guys must have, when you use your computer, you must have seen that little pop-up, with a big S on it, possibly, because that's from the media giant Cellon, but many others are doing it, which will tell you, if you don't like to see a pop-up ads, press this button. Do you know what that button actually does, suppress ad buttons? It is hijacking, cryptojacking your CPU, and then the organization that's sending malware, it's actually malware, takes over your computer, and after a while you might find that your computer, you're just browsing the web, it's grinding to almost a halt. So essentially what they're doing is they are taking unused CPU across a whole distributed range of computers worldwide and mining a currency, a cryptocurrency called Monero. So I'm going to skip this one, and we'll talk about some other kinds of attacks that we have to be careful about, which is data theft. We have brand reputation to protect, and we have customer data and other data as well that we're responsible for, and many organizations in critical infrastructure and outside are responsible for. Some of the sensational attacks we heard about of data theft was that of Deloitte, of Equifax, and Uber, and each of these, I just brought out Deloitte and Equifax because Deloitte is one of the top 4 cyber practice firms in the world. They should have known better. What happened? How were the emails hacked? So they did not use multi-factor authentication. Can you believe that? They did not use multi-factor authentication, and their Microsoft-hosted mailboxes were, in fact, stolen, breached. Equifax, Equifax, the way that that breach took place was through a vulnerability in the Apache web server, for which, and hear this out, for which patches had been out 5 months earlier, which means that it was a preventable attack had they patched 5 months earlier. And I mean, this was a very widely publicized attack. The CEO was sacked. So again, no matter how sophisticated the attack is, the entry points are always your weakest link in the chain. But I'm going to skip that. So I've talked about good cyber hygiene being the best practice, and I'll leave Facebook to Alex to talk about. I'm going to finish with, with this thought that government is taking this concern very seriously, and in the recently released budget, our government has committed to over basically $500 million over the next 5 years to fight cybercrime, including the setting up of a research center, and we expect that CSE will have more and more of a role in overseeing cybersecurity. And so we, these are some of the organizations we work with, and I'll leave emerging technologies to Alex to talk about it. I did want to talk for a second about IoTs because it really affects our threat surface. We have about 18 billion devices connected now, and in about 2 years we expect this to more than double to 50 billion connected devices. So we're talking about your light bulb which is connected, your camera that's connected, your fridge that's connected. And do the manufacturers of many of these devices even think about security by design or privacy by design? So we're going to be looking at a very evolving landscape where just like when Mr. Ford came out with his cars and there were accidents galore, we're going to find an organically evolving a landscape where all of these manufacturers are going to have to be regulated so that they can have security built in. And we'll talk a little bit more during question and answer time about how this is going to play out. But my intent was not to drive you all to be scared of what's going to happen or to spread fear, but it's really to educate you and to get into a mindfulness, a state of mindfulness and a state of preparedness. It's going to take everybody's engagement in this. And I'm going to end with the positive words of General Douglas MacArthur. There's no security on this earth. There's only opportunity. Let's grab the opportunities that emerging technologies give us while being prepared. Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much, Najma, for that. I think your deep intellect in this subject is matched only by your enthusiasm. Next, we're going to hear from Dr. Alex Wilner. Are you going to do it from here? You're going to go up there. Okay. So Alex is joining us from NIPSIA. That's the Norman Paterson School of International Affairs at Carleton University. I think some folks in the crowd will know Alex. He teaches classes in cybersecurity and emerging technologies, among other areas related to international security. He's published a number of books on the topic area of deterrence and is also widely published in scholarly and professional journals. And as you can see from his slide, he's going to speak to us today about the Internet of Things, digital misinformation, and artificial intelligence. Alex?
Thank you. Bonjour tout le monde. Hello, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here. Let me start by saying that when I drove to Toronto today, and driving to Toronto felt different. And so I know Ottawa sometimes feels far away from Toronto. I've lived in Toronto, of course, but the horrific events of yesterday touched us in the nation's capital quite dearly. I know that as it touched you. So anyways, I appreciated our moment of silence at the beginning, so I won't dwell on this, but it was quite a dramatic day. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to start by thanking the RCMI and WIIS Canada for inviting me to join you in this fabulous building. I had the distinct pleasure of walking up and down the stairs. I urge you to do so. Your heart will thank you, but your eyeballs will thank you too, because there's amazing weaponry on the walls. So it's really quite a building, and it's fascinating to see that it exists in the heart of Toronto. You wouldn't, I think, otherwise think of it. So it's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank Daniel and his team in particular for inviting me. and to thank Melinda and Najma for their kind words. I had the pleasure of sitting down with Najma just this past Friday at Hydro Ottawa, and we spoke for an hour and a half. Can you imagine how much I learned in an hour and a half? It was quite fabulous. She is a Wonder Woman, I think probably unique in Canada. I'm telling you. Anyhow, I want to cover quite a bit of ground. Different topics, each relating to the way that emerging technology changes the way we think about national security, defense planning, and foreign policy. I want to do three things. Basically, I want to talk about digitalized hardware. Najma introduced it, the so-called Internet of Things, or IoT for short. And I want to relate that to emerging cybersecurity issues on the global scale. Then I want to discuss digital misinformation campaigns and relate that to defense planning and foreign policy initiatives. And the third issue I want to talk about is the way that artificial intelligence, known by its acronym AI, will affect human rights, governance, and cybersecurity. And so clearly I'm going to cover, so I'm moving beyond, really. I'm moving beyond pure national defense. But I think doing so is necessary because as I see it, emerging technologies like these shrink the space between defense planning and national security, intelligence work, good governance, and foreign policy. So it's interesting, but it's also quite rather important to kind of lump all of these topics together and look at them through the lens of emerging technology. I should also note that much of what I'm going to speak about today will be published in an article in International Journal forthcoming this summer. So if you want to get the written version of this, you can certainly do so in a couple of months. Let me start with the IoT. My first concern is the emergence of these billions of tethered wireless objects. The Internet of Things is a digital landscape that connects everyday objects to each other. So private sector assessments suggest that there will be several billions of these objects will be tethered and online in the coming years. Everything from your fridge to your child's toy to the fork that you put into your mouth, your home thermostat, and so on will be linked online, forming this intricate web of sensors, data, and machinery. From a security perspective, many of these devices are engineered to be user-friendly and cheap, and cybersecurity is not a priority. Najma mentioned this. The problem is that these devices can be corrupted, they can be hacked, and they can be attacked. In June of 2017, in an apparent first, an American casino lost data after an IoT fish tank was hacked. So the hackers gained access to the casino through the IoT fish tank. Data was stolen as a result, etc., etc., etc. Using IoT devices to steal personal or financial data is but one emerging threat. Another is that IoT devices will become new targets for ransomware. You've probably heard of the ransomware. We're going to talk about it a little bit more today. It's a type of malicious code that allows third parties to lock down your data, which is then held ransom or hostage until you pay the ransom, usually in a Bitcoin or some kind of cryptocurrency. A ransomware attack brought the city of Atlanta in the United States to its knees just a few weeks ago. I think in the near future, our IoT devices will be held hostage. Should I click that, Najma? It just popped up. I think it's a crypto miner. Our IoT devices will be held hostage. You'll only gain control of your smart toothbrush once you pay criminals to release it. More pressing, however, is that the use of IoT technology to conduct global network attacks. The 2016 Dyn attack, the cyber attack, is a good illustration of this. Dyn is a company that provides online infrastructure, domain registration, and email services. You've probably never heard of it. It doesn't matter. During that specific attack, hackers used malware to infect hundreds of thousands of online devices, from baby monitors and routers, and they lassoed them into something called a botnet, which is a portmanteau for robot and network that suggests a kind of army of zombie devices controlled remotely by a third party. In this particular case, that botnet was used to launch several DDoS attacks, distributed denial of service attacks, on this company, on Dyn. And the result was the flooding of online platforms with false information and false traffic requests. And so the result on our end was that websites crashed across Europe and North America. That's a little close for comfort. It's just this? Okay, fine. High-profile companies lost their websites, including Amazon, PayPal, Twitter, etc. So as the IoT emerges, we need to think about the evolution of Dyn-like attacks targeting our public utilities and our online government service provision platforms. We need to appreciate what the risks are to public safety and welfare and to assess the potential for lasting damage in the ways in which governments engage with citizens, store our data, and provide the necessary services that we need. So new regulations and industry standards, I think, for the IoT will show some promise. We can maybe get into those in the Q&A. But basically what we'll have to do is ensure that IoT devices themselves are cyber safe, but also that the users, ourselves, know how to use them properly. The next topic that I want to talk about is digital misinformation. And it involves the emerging nexus between digital information, propaganda, and strategic misinformation used to weaken democracies or embarrass governments or scuttle diplomacy, and in some cases to justify conflicts and military intervention. We often think of hacking as an attempt to steal data or intellectual property, but there's another concern: using hacks to propagate misinformation for geostrategic or military gain. Cyberspace is not only about protecting infrastructure or safeguarding information, it's also about protecting what we know and how we know it. It involves safeguarding the integrity of data and protecting the truths from mistruths. Propaganda, of course, as you know, has been a tool of diplomacy, intelligence, and warfare for generations. But what is new, I think, today is the pervasiveness of digital information, the interconnectedness between people and that information, and the speed with which misinformation can be spread and used for strategic purpose. So I want to use two examples. The first comes from the US. So by now, you know that Russia sought to manipulate the 2016 US presidential election. If you don't know that, you've been living under a rock. What's interesting is that rather than promote a specific ideology or political position, Russia's misinformation campaign sought to manipulate pre-existing social and political divides already in place within the US electorate. And it wanted to do that to undermine its democracy. So Russia did so by promoting and purchasing media content in support of a variety of divergent views. So Russian content supported both pro and anti-immigrant views, anti-gun but pro-police voices, pro and anti-LGBTQ material, and so on and so forth. The point was to provide voters, American voters, with all sorts of sharply divergent views to create bigger rifts among Americans. But Russia sought to manipulate the election in a second way too, by stealing sensitive material from high-ranking Democrats and publishing them online to embarrass the political party. You're likely familiar with the process, but as a general recap, in the months leading up to the US election, Kremlin hackers stole data from the Democratic National Committee, the DNC, the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, DCCC, and John Podesta, who was Hillary Clinton's campaign chair. Thousands of documents were then leaked by an entity called Guccifer 2.0, hacker or likely hackers responsible for the breach, and those were posted on WikiLeaks, my favorite website, and I'm just joking, not my favorite website, and DC Leaks, which is a suspected Russian front for Russian intelligence. The documents, those published documents were real. They certainly embarrassed high-ranking Democrats, staff, and Democratic funders. Some of the posted material undermined Clinton's chief rival for the Democratic Party nomination. You'll remember him, Bernie Sanders. That infuriated his base, of course, which further split Democrats. Now here's the really fascinating part. At one point, Guccifer 2.0, the hacker, posted a batch of documents attributed to Nancy Pelosi. She's the House Minority Leader and prominent California Democrat. You probably know her, or at least her picture. The hacker explained that the stolen Pelosi files had come from her personal computer at the DCCC, at the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee. And the documents, I think, were especially inflammatory. They dealt with immigration, Hispanics, black votes, Islam, and so on. Black Lives Matter, an American activist group advocating for black rights, was furious, especially vocal in their condemnation of Democrats, calling the Pelosi material inflammatory. The Pelosi files were deeply embarrassing to the Democrats. They were used by right-wing bloggers and media sources to make a case against Hillary Clinton. Now, there's only one problem in this scheme, is that Nancy Pelosi did not have a personal computer at the DCCC. So where the hacks were said to have occurred. And so her office responded, no hacked, dumped, or doctored documents can be attributed to Pelosi's computer. So in all likelihood, the Pelosi files were clever fakes, packaged and published alongside real documents to make a mess for the Democrats. But that didn't stop anybody from sharing the documents online, especially right-wing bloggers and personalities who had an absolute field day with the material. So Russia's campaign of hacks, leaks, and deception during the US election had accomplished its task. Truth from mistruth were in the eyes of the beholder, and Americans couldn't tell the difference between real information and false information. And of course, some certainly didn't care. Nope, too fast. My second example of strategic digital misinformation comes from the Middle East. This one will go a little quicker. It's an episode It's an episode that describes how hacking and misinformation was used to justify conflict between states, not within states. So on May 24th of 2017, following a hack of its website and Twitter account, Qatar's state-run news agency published inflammatory quotes attributed to their emir, to their leader. He called Iran a legitimate regional and Islamic power. He suggested that Hamas, the militant organization in control of Gaza, was the only true representative of the Palestinian people. He suggested that military relations between Qatar and Israel were very good, and that tensions marred Qatar's relationship with President Trump. Qatar's rivals, regional rivals, seized upon the news, and a diplomatic standoff followed. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Egypt, and others cut diplomatic relations with Qatar. Ambassadors were pulled from the country. Qatar was expelled from the Saudi coalition fighting in Yemen. Other Arab and North African countries imposed a travel and trade embargo. Flights from Qatar were totally suspended. Qatari visitors to several Gulf states were ordered to leave, and Al Jazeera, which is based in Qatar, was blocked. So while the diplomatic spat was an extension of simmering tensions between Qatar and Saudi Arabia, it crimped American relations with both. Qatar is home to 10,000 US troops, many of them fighting on the front lines with ISIS. And so the episode exploded just days after President Trump had concluded his visit, his first, to Saudi Arabia. So the product of a well-timed and well-placed hack, this latest rift in the Middle East is a harbinger of the future, in which cyber misinformation is used to sow division, to upend alliances and security guarantees, and to lay the foundation for conflict between states. My third concern has to do with artificial intelligence. AI is a field of science that provides machines with human-like qualities in problem solving, reasoning, and learning. There are two general types of AI. The first is narrow AI, which uses algorithms to complete a specific task, like learning to play chess or Go, or to recognize faces. While these programs might eventually excel at this specific task and outperform human competitors, they are much less able to play other games or to solve other problems that they are not originally programmed to. General AI, which does not yet exist, seeks to accomplish that latter task. It's meant to empower a machine to learn and to solve any number of problems much as humans do. AI includes a number of tools and techniques and methods. Perhaps you've heard of machine learning, which basically trains an algorithm to identify regularities in reams of data. And machine learning itself can be further divided into different subfields, including reinforcement learning, in which the program is built with feedback mechanisms. AI holds tremendous potential for governments. I think in the best case, AI will be able to analyze a large volume of data far more quickly than humans, identifying insights and trends that might have gone overlooked, something Najma mentioned with her work. And that will provide suggestions on how to improve public services. The same holds for intelligence, policing, and national security and defense. AI will be able to assist in the analysis of data and intelligence, pointing human analysts, police officers, and military personnel in the right direction. AI, as you know and have probably read, is already providing its worth in a number of fields. In finance, it is improving economic efficiencies and countering money laundering. In medicine, AI is identifying cancers, heart disease, and Alzheimer's. In academia, it's improving theories long defined by physics. In commerce, it's streamlining the shopping experience by eliminating the checkout line. In agriculture, AI is expanding yields. In emergency preparedness, it is directing first responders in aid. And in entertainment, AI informs your next binge-watching spasm on Netflix. The risks, though, I think are many. In terms of defense, you're probably most familiar with AI as it relates to UAVs or drones. I think a disproportionate amount of attention and critique today is reserved for autonomous weapon systems, sometimes referred to as killer robots. Perhaps some of you in this room have actually signed the UN-supported global petition to ban such weapons. The problem I have with our collective focus on killer robots is that it misses a far more dangerous, more nefarious, and I think more widespread concern. That AI will touch on and alter the way in which we defend human rights, conduct cybersecurity, and promote democracy and good governance. So let me unpack this. First, AI serves the purposes of all governments, including those that Canada disagrees with on human rights, democracy, gender equality, and geostrategic stability. AI also has a dual use quality to it, used for both progressive and for malicious purposes. So accordingly, AI will provide authoritarian regimes the ability to better monitor dissent, to control their populations, and to target certain minorities. Already, Stanford University researchers have developed an AI that uses photographs to identify a person's sexual orientation. The algorithm has a predictive success rate of 90%. That may prove horrendously useful to the over 70 countries that still criminalize homosexuality. And China's development of the social credit system, in which AI facial recognition technology is paired with a social scoring scheme to rank an individual's quality of civic engagement. Now that's going to, democracy I think will suffer as a result of that. The second risk is that AI will be useful for both defensive and for offensive cybersecurity, something Najma touched upon. In 2016, DARPA, the research wing of the US Department of Defense, ran something called the Cyber Grand Challenge. This was basically a bug hunting competition akin to a digital game of capture the flag. 7 teams, different teams, used AI to automatically identify and patch internal flaws while exploiting external weaknesses identified in opponents' machines. So that is, in this case, cyber AI was used for defensive and for offensive purposes. The algorithms themselves went on the hunt for exploitable weaknesses in an adversary's computer system. Now, you will know that historically, advances in defense have often led to advances in offense. And so researchers are now using AI to trick AIs, effectively using machine learning to adapt to AI cyber defense to produce new versions of malware better able to penetrate targets. So an AI arms race in cyberspace between cyber professionals is not far off. The third concern, I think, finally, is that AI sometimes shows its biases. For instance, in the United States, an AI program used to assess recidivism rates of prisoners was shown to be systematically biased against black inmates. And Google advertising system was more likely to show women ads for lower paying jobs. In other cases, AI has absorbed the worst of human characteristics. Please read that. Tay was built to mimic millennials and to, quote, experiment with and conduct research on conventional understanding. In March 2016, Microsoft released Tay, a chat box on Twitter. So basically, people were free to interact with it. In less than 20 hours, Tay's tweet went from hello world and humans are super cool to Hitler was right, I hate the Jews, and I fracking hate feminists and they should all burn in hell. So bias in AI can be the product of bias that is purposefully or accidentally built into the algorithm itself. Or bias can result from inherent biases embedded in the data that we use to train the algorithm, which is what happened in Tay's case. AI basically mimics findings buried in the data. So while machine bias may matter less, I think, when it comes to recommending your next movie on Netflix, machine bias will matter a great deal when it is used for government services. The problem from a public perspective is that many algorithms are proprietary in nature. So by all accounts, the private sector will dictate the future parameters of AI by developing and owning the algorithms, but also by generating and controlling the training data. Much of this information will be considered trade secrets, unavailable for public scrutiny. But there's an even more pervasive problem, and I'll end here. Some AI decisions are so complex that developing a human understanding of the decision-making process is not possible. Some algorithms, in effect, are black boxes. Even if the algorithm is known and how it works and how it outputs and how it makes its outputs are unclear. Have you ever heard of Google's gorilla problem? This is a case in point. In 2015, Google's Photos app, which uses AI to tag and sort your pictures, classified black people as gorillas. Google was mortified. It obviously raced to correct the algorithm. This was 2015. 3 years later, the best solution that Google has come up with is to censor searches and tags for gorilla, chimp, chimpanzee, monkey, and African American, and to strip the racial but not the gender context out of searches for black man or black woman. So instead of fixing the AI, or worse, because Google has found out that it can't fix the AI, it has opted to effectively ban certain words. So to conclude, the future of national defense, national security, intelligence, foreign policy, and good governance are all linked together, each running through emerging disruptive technologies. It behooves us to think creatively and broadly about how changes to technology will affect changes in the way we think about and conduct defense planning. Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you very much, Alex. I think both you and Najma have given us quite a lot to think about, and in fact, I'm seriously reconsidering the smart technology toothbrush I bought last night.
Did you?
I think that I did. Yeah. Should I take it back?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I've already used it. That might be a problem. Anyhow, so as you're collecting your thoughts, I would invite you to come up to the microphones for the Q&A period if there are questions in the audience. But to get things started, just Najma, I want to come back to something you mentioned in your presentation. You said that as you were concluding, you said you don't want to engender fear. But how do we educate for the risks associated with emergent technologies as it relates to, critical infrastructure without cultivating fear and over-securitizing the issue? And maybe both of you can speak to that. I'll go to you first, Najma.
Yeah, sure. So like I had said, that what we need is preparedness. And I gave these examples primarily to show that we are as weak as our weakest link. It is not the sophistication of the attack, but really the education of the people, the engagement of the people. And as an example, we could do public engagement, which includes drills. What we do in the energy sector is that we do tabletop exercise every 2 years called GridX across all of North America. So what I believe the industry is getting pretty tight on its own practice, but the awareness isn't there. The fire department does a great job of running these fire drills. So we need something like that so that we exercise and plan for the event of any emergency that could occur. So what we need as part of our resilience is, we prepare, we ensure that we have ways to identify, to detect, protect, and in an event of occurring, we need to know how to respond. So if we don't exercise it, then at that time there's confusion. So that's what we can do. I think emerging technologies are giving us opportunities to improve the human condition, but with it comes risk. So we just need to be resilient and prepare for those risks.
So I'm looking around the room and I see a lot of gray hair, including my own. So a lot of this, even if you go to cyberspace is still relatively new to us. Part of the problem is that the people in power, and I'm not being critical here, including myself, people in positions of power, regulators, government, don't necessarily understand the dynamics going on between emerging technologies, whether in cyberspace or otherwise, and the regulatory space and the policy and strategic space. So part of it is a generational gap. I think our children, my children, will learn how to use and be cyber safe kind of inherent. I believe they'll be inherently able to do so. I think cyber hygiene won't be an issue in 10 to 15 years from now, and so on. In the meantime, we're catching up. And so there's a telling episode of Mark Zuckerberg, the founder and CEO of Facebook, when he sat before Congress a matter of weeks ago. And he basically apologized. And what did he apologize for? He apologized because he thought Facebook wasn't what it was. He was saying that Facebook was a platform for sharing ideas, not that it was a space in which media representation and different types of knowledge might be shared. And so what he said is that in the 15 years or 12 years that Facebook has been around, its evolution surprised even the CEO. Yeah. He wasn't necessarily aware of how Facebook could be corrupted to sow division and to sow even violence. And so if Mark Zuckerberg can't realize what's happening in technology 10 years hence, or 15 years from its inception, then I think we have a learning curve. And I think that's where we're at. So part of it is right. Najma says we need educators. We need to educate our children. We need to educate ourselves and our companies and our policymakers.
Yeah, in the Facebook, what transpired with Facebook, as it stands today, nothing illegal happened. the Facebook end user license agreement is pretty loose, and it is loose for a purpose because their intent is to have open sharing. Why abusers feel so violated is that their trust circle was violated. They were expecting that that information will stay within their chosen trust circle. They didn't realize that there is data scraping that is happening in the background, and that data is being given out to parties that they did not agree to.
Just one more thought before we take a question. I think it's Sweden, and it's certainly one of the Scandinavian countries, is exploring and likely to introduce this coming year changes to the curriculum starting for grade 3 in cyber awareness, right? So they're taking shit seriously. They're saying to their children, we need you to be cyber aware. You need to be more analytical in thinking about how you engage with cyberspace, what you post in cyberspace, what you believe in cyberspace.
There's a value to that information. What is the value you put on it?
Precisely.
We have a question.
So in your presentation, Najma, you seem to say that 5% of the IT resource allocation in Ottawa is associated with protection, with
most organizations who, and this is at the high end, because cyber programs tend to be risk driven. They're not ROI driven.
Exactly. So anyhow, I'm trying to understand, try to characterize, I guess, how much really is being done. Is it 5% of your staffing as well? Is this, does this represent a force, you know, a number of people, a number of activities that is similar then to the threat or to the...
This is a very good question, and it's a dilemma that we deal with on an ongoing basis. Those of us who run cyber programs have to be smart about where that money is invested, because you have to invest in infrastructure, you have to invest in people, and you have to invest in processes, because you have mandatory regulations from, say, the government, the regulator, and then we have our own voluntary rules that we impose upon ourselves as an organization and on our people. I was talking to Alex, last week, and we were talking about, well, these voluntary impositions allow us to deter within our own organizations. So yeah, you are right that this does not represent 5% of the people force in an organization. What it means is that with that maximum of 5% dollars, how do you allocate your dollars so that you can be most effective? And you take a combination, you see what your risk profile is and how you can most mitigate. Start with your inherent risk, and then after you've done your mitigation measures, what is the residual risk you're left with to manage. So that's what we can do with that 5%. So we are very dependent for certain things on, let's say, a managed services rather than have in-house staffing or automated tools. And we are dependent on behaviors. We're dependent on external assistance. What is most important for all of us to understand is cybersecurity is not a technology problem. It's a business problem. Now it's become a social and national problem. There are many areas intertwined to make cybersecurity, allow us to be resilient against cyber attacks.
Thank you. We'll go to this side of the room.
Hi, I'm Catherine Langley Hope. I'm a member here, and I'm also the Vice Chair of the NATO Association of Canada. So I'd like to combine two of the concepts you're discussing. I'd like to bring it around to a discussion that happened between Jim Basili from RIM, Blackberry, and Norman Deutsch, who's very well known as a neurologist that talks about neuroplasticity of the brain, and thinking about these impacts of what is being imposed or created, partly with AI, but also there's very good evidence apparently that youngsters now who are taken away from their computer or from their cell phone or iPad or iPods are showing changes in their brain function. And I'm wondering how much is being looked at from the point of view of how that can be another subversive component that we haven't really looked at very well, and that is obviously changing the dynamic so much when you see 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, and 4-year-olds literally using a small computer and almost being used as a babysitter. And I'm wondering how much of that concept is being considered along with all of these other physical components and safeguards.
Do you want to start?
So I would add to that the recent studies showing that use of social media can cause or lead to depression amongst teenagers, including depression that leads to suicidal thoughts and acts. And so I think, it's not my area of research per se, but I do think that there are deep ways in which our engagement with technology, including cyber technology and cyberspace and all the platforms therein, how that affects our relationships with our loved ones, with our parents, with each other, and with our own identity as a human being. So I think you're right that, I'm glad to hear that the medical experts are kind of pushing this forward with hard science, because when a social science says this, people laugh them off.
Well, sorry, a part of my concern too is we're looking at these acronyms and models of artificial intelligence, and we've seen some of the results of that. So who's inputting into that, and therefore what is that secondary effect that many of us probably don't. I said, when you were talking about AI and the programs that have been put out and what's happened, is how many of those may have components that haven't been recognized by the people who are creating them that will add to the issue.
Have something to add to that?
Well, if someone else wants to talk, I don't want to take his time. Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry, do you have
and just very quickly. So, the issues that I brought up with AI, especially bias, machine bias, are known. They're being discussed, and they're being discussed within Canadian decision makers. And so last week I was at an event on AI and human rights and governance at Global Affairs Canada, and they're taking the Canadian lead to promote Canada's AI and foreign policy strategy, which I think they're going to table it in the next couple of months. And around the table were people like me who have no reason to be there, and the people who own and run these machines, the AI machines. And they were saying we are aware of bias, we are aware of how our algorithms interact with bias within the data, and they're trying to fix the problem. I think what we need is regulations to force them to fix the problem. They weren't very keen to talk about the R word.
I think I agree with what Alex has said, and there is evolution that's required, but at the same time, not everything can depend only on a technology cure. What is leading to these, why are children in front of computers that much? I mean, there are many social factors at play here. We need to look at ourselves as a society and see, how are we parenting our kids? How are we raising our kids? What are the values that we have started espousing as a society that is leading us to disengage human-to-human interaction and use, say, the machine as a babysitter? I mean, there's a lot more at play here, and that's why I think that this is becoming a wider social issue than the discourse has so far evolved into.
Thank you.
Okay. Connie Carter, I'm a member of RCMI and the CIC. So my question actually goes into what Alex just said, the R word. I was in Florida when Mark Zuckerberg was doing his testimony in America. And what he said as well is that we would like to be regulated. Now, I wondered how serious he was about that, or was he really saying there is no way of regulating it? Like you said, Facebook seems to have got away from him. So in what areas, and I'm specifically thinking about privacy and looking at what the European Union is doing, their law about that will come out in May. And is Canada and perhaps America doing anything in that area which would actually help to say this is where your boundaries are? Can there be any boundaries?
So regulations are tricky, right? And the reason that the private sector doesn't necessarily, maybe the Zuckerberg case is an anomaly, but regulations hem private sectors in a box. And they're meant to do that to safeguard privacy, security, and so on. So regulations are tricky, because if you impose strict regulations on an emerging technology, you risk stifling innovation in that country. And there are cases in Canada in which blockchain is the rails upon which cryptocurrencies and other types of technology sits upon. A lot of that technology was developed in Canada, but they didn't have the right regulatory space in Canada, so where did they move? To Switzerland. because Switzerland provided better tax breaks, better regulations, somebody to call within foreign affairs, whatever. And so Canadian innovators moved because of the threat of regulations or the lack of regulations. So we have to find that sweet spot where we purposefully regulate where we need to, smartly, without stifling innovation. Now, with the Europeans are far ahead of the Americans, and I believe the Canadians. I was in my notes, but I didn't mention it. It's the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. It goes into effect in May, so in a couple of weeks, effectively. It will do all kinds. It's a very thick document. To be honest, I haven't read it all. I will never read it all. But the point is, from within that regulation, there are specific aspects tailored towards AI. And so one of the aspects that intrigues me is a requirement for somebody, a citizen of the EU, upon which an AI has decided they have the right to go then ask for the process by which that recommendation was made. So what does that mean? If you go ask for a loan to buy a house, or whatever it is, and the AI machine in the European continent suggests that you're unsafe to loan to, you can ask for a printout for how the machine came up with that decision. Interesting. So that's not a privacy issue, but it's another issue, and it's not necessarily related with governance, but it's related with banking and so on. I think this new law will affect how companies act. Zuckerberg had said that he's happy for the European regulation because he will change the way Facebook works in other continents, and so on and so forth. So let's see how the Europeans handle this. Let's hope it doesn't stifle innovation, and then let's build off that.
Okay, I think we'll take one final question.
Mark Baker, BCP Risk Management. I'd just like your comment on what I've seen with many of my clients in terms of cybersecurity. It's quite often a question of money and resources. People quite often automate to save money, to essentially reduce their costs, and now suddenly you walk in and say, and you've now got to increase your costs because of this. So I'm wondering how much you'd like to see that, how much you're seeing that in your areas out there. And the other thing is, when you say that kids are better with cybersecurity, I hate to say this, I see no evidence of that. They're better doing this, but they really have no idea quite often of what this really means. And maybe some of us who are a little older and a little more cynical are a little more scared, and perhaps that's a good thing.
Okay.
Well, you know, I think I sort of touched upon it earlier, that yes, it is true that with automation, it doesn't mean that you save money overall to do on your IT budget, because that you've automated one task because you needed to do so many others, and your costs go in a different direction. You're redirecting your staff in a different direction. We are dealing with a very evolving landscape, and there's just so much that organizations have to do that it doesn't look like there is a stop and a saving, so to say.
I got my first Hotmail account when I was 19, and I used Google for the first time when I was 21. Still remember that word, Google. You probably remember the time in your life, maybe middle age, when you use those machines. My students are quite a bit younger than I. They got their first email accounts in grade school when they were 6, 7, and I can tell you that they are very suspicious of what they post online. Why? Because if they sex a picture, or if they do any inflammatory language, they know it survives for eternity, and that when they graduate from NIPSIA, they won't get jobs. Because the first thing you're going to do as an employer is you're going to Google their names. It took my generation quite a while to get to that point. We didn't realize that when you click, it's saved for life. They appreciate that already. And so we grew up with education in HIV, in safe sex, those kind of things. They grew up with the equivalent of safe sex online. So I do think there's a generational divide. They're not much younger than you. Even 10 years will do it. They're far safer in terms of what they're posting and how they're posting. And I imagine that those 10 to 15 years younger than them are going to be out of this world different in terms of, I hope, because that's my children's generation. But we'll see. Thank you.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, that concludes our time for this panel. But if you would join me in thanking them for providing their perspective into what I will call the cost of living in a connected world, I think is higher than the cost of living in Toronto.